Here's something quite striking. Despite all the wars and tension between India and Pakistan, there's this one agreement, the Indus Waters Treaty from 1960.
Hmm.
And for over 60 years, it actually prevented any major conflict over water. It's often called one of the world's most successful water-sharing deals.
It really is fascinating. And that treaty is what we're diving into today. It's been, well, such a critical piece in a very complicated relationship.
Signed September 19th, 1960, in Karachi. Nehru for India, Ayub Khan for Pakistan. The whole idea was peaceful sharing of the Indus rivers.
Exactly. And for a long, long time, it seemed to work.
Yeah.
But as we'll get into, based on our sources, things have gotten pretty shaky recently. Some really big developments.
Right. So for you listening, this isn't just, a history lesson. Understanding this treaty, and especially these recent changes, it's pretty crucial for understanding India-Pakistan dynamics today and what might happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. This deep dive is about more than just one treaty. It's about how countries handle shared resources, vital resources, when the world around them changes. So our goal is to unpack it, all the treaty itself, the recent shifts, and what it could all mean.
Okay, let's start with the basics. The river system itself, we're talking about 6 main rivers, right?
That's right. They usually get divided into 2 groups. You've got the 3 eastern rivers, Sutlej, Beas, and Ravi.
Okay.
And then the 3 western rivers, the Indus itself, the Chame, and the Chenab.
And the treaty basically splits control.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
India got full control over those eastern rivers. That's about, 41 billion cubic meters a year.
Right.
Pakistan got control over the western rivers, and that's significantly more water, around 99 billion cubic meters annually.
So doing the math quickly, that's like roughly 20-30% for India and 70-80% for Pakistan of the whole system's flow.
Pretty much, yeah. And you really can't overstate how important those western rivers are for Pakistan. They're often called its lifeline.
It's lifeline. Okay. So India controls the eastern ones completely. What about the western rivers? Can India use them at all?
Yes, but with restrictions. The treaty allows India some limited use for things like irrigation. But crucially, it has unrestricted rights for what they call non-consumptive uses.
Like hydropower, generating electricity, navigation, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Hydropower is a big one there. As long as it doesn't, significantly affect the water flow downstream to Pakistan.
Okay, so it wasn't just about dividing the water. The treaty set up mechanisms too, right, to manage things.
Oh, definitely. A really key part was establishing the Permanent Indus Commission. PIC for short.
PIC, okay.
It has commissioners from both India and Pakistan. They're supposed to meet at least once a year. Their job is, sharing information about the rivers, data, plans, and trying to sort out any disagreements or issues that come up.
And what if the commission couldn't sort things out? Was there a next step?
Yeah, the treaty laid out a whole dispute resolution process, kind of a step-by-step thing.
How did that work?
First, just bilateral talks.
Mm.
The 2 governments try to work it out directly.
Makes sense.
If that doesn't work, the next step could be bringing in a neutral expert, someone impartial to look at the technical aspects.
Right.
And then, only if that fails, or for certain kinds of disputes, it could go to a court of arbitration, like a formal international court.
So layers of potential resolution. It sounds like, when they signed it, there was a real spirit of trying to cooperate.
Right.
Goodwill, even friendship.
That's what the sources emphasize, yeah. The original intent seemed quite positive.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, they deliberately kept things like security issues, terrorism, completely separate from the water agreement back then.
Hmm. But Pakistan, being downstream, the lower riparian state, as they say,
Right.
they must have had concerns even then about India maybe using water as a weapon.
Oh, absolutely. That concern has always been there. The fear that India, being upstream, could potentially, cause floods during monsoon season or withhold water during dry periods, especially if tensions were high. It's actually, a testament to the treaty that for decades, those fears didn't really materialize into a water war, despite everything else going on. That term lower riparian state just means you're downstream, so you depend on what happens upstream.
Okay, but fast forward to more recent times, the mid-2020s. Things seem to have changed quite dramatically. Our sources point to around 2016 as the starting point.
Yeah, that seems to be a key moment. The big signal was after the Uri terror attack in September 2016.
Right.
That's when Prime Minister Modi made that statement, blood and water cannot flow together. It was a very strong hint that India was starting to rethink keeping water separate from security.
A really powerful phrase. And it wasn't just talk, right? Things moved towards more concrete actions after that.
They did. The first really formal step came in January 2023. India sent an official notice to Pakistan through the Indus Commissioner channels.
What did the notice say?
It basically requested starting government-to-government negotiations within 90 days to, and this is the key word, amend parts of the treaty.
Amend. Not scrap, but change. Why did India say it wanted amendments? What were the reasons given?
Well, the official line, according to the material, pointed to what India called Pakistan's obduracy, their word, and persistent obstruction in how the treaty was being implemented.
Obstruction how?
Specifically, it seems the trigger was Pakistan initiating arbitration proceedings for two Indian hydropower projects, Kishanga and Radal.
Ah, those projects have been contentious for a while.
Exactly. India argued that Pakistan, jumping straight to arbitration, violated the treaty's step-by-step process. India felt the next step should have been the neutral expert, not the court of arbitration yet.
So a procedural dispute, essentially, but it blew up.
It seems so. And it got complicated because apparently Pakistan's move led to parallel processes, starting one with a neutral expert and one with the court of arbitration.
Which sounds messy. Did the World Bank get involved? They brokered the original treaty, didn't they?
They did. And yes, the World Bank actually tried to intervene back in 2016. They suggested a pause on these parallel processes because they saw it as potentially problematic, stemming from, as they put it, Pakistan's inflexibility on the sequence.
But that pause didn't resolve the underlying issue.
Apparently not, which likely contributed to India sending that formal notice for amendment talks in 2023.
And India didn't let it rest there. Just last year, August 2024, another notice.
Yes, another formal notice, this time under specific clause, Article 12 of the treaty, again, demanding a review and amendment.
And did they give different reasons this time?
They elaborated more. They explicitly mentioned fundamental and unforeseen changes as the justification.
Okay, fundamental and unforeseen changes. What kind of changes were they talking about?
Several things mentioned in our sources. First, just the massive population growth in both countries since 1960. Huge increase in water demand.
Makes sense.
Second, environmental changes. Big ones. Climate change impacts. Glaciers melting in the Himalayas, weird rainfall patterns, more droughts, more floods. Stuff nobody really foresaw in 1960.
Right. Climate change wasn't on the radar then.
Not like today. And third, India's growing need for clean energy, especially hydropower. Again, the scale of that need wasn't anticipated back then. Plus, they continued to link it to the issue of cross-border terrorism from Pakistan.
So a combination of factors: population, environment, energy needs, and security. And India started getting tougher on the existing treaty mechanisms, too.
That's right. India apparently indicated it wasn't willing to go ahead with the regular Permanent Indus Commission meetings unless Pakistan agreed to actually sit down and renegotiate the treaty provisions.
Wow. So basically putting the brakes on the whole institutional dialogue.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Stalling the mechanism that had been ticking along for decades.
And then things took an even sharper turn. April 2025. The attack in Pahalgam.
Yes, that seems to have been the absolute tipping point. The terrorist attack in Pahalgam, Kashmir, by Zarangati, April 22nd, 2025. 26 tourists killed. Just horrific.
And India's reaction was immediate.
Extremely swift. The very next day, April 23rd, the Prime Minister chaired an emergency meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security. And the decisions that came out were, well, unprecedented.
The big one being about the treaty itself.
The headline decision. India announced the suspension or halting of the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty. Indefinitely.
Suspension, not termination. Is there a difference?
Legally, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the practical effect was immediate, and India attached a condition for lifting the suspension.
Which was?
Pakistan must credibly and irreversibly cease its support for cross-border terrorism. That was the direct quote reported.
A very direct link. And were there other measures taken that same day?
Yes, several. Closing the Atari-Wagah land border crossing, canceling special visas for Pakistanis, and reducing the staff levels at the high commissions in both capitals.
So a really strong package of measures. The message seems crystal clear.
Absolutely unambiguous. The era of separating blood and water, as Modi put it earlier, was declared over by New Delhi.
Yeah.
The treaty, for now, is in what India calls abeyance, something never seen before in its entire history.
Okay, let's unpack the why behind this huge shift. We've touched on it, but let's focus on the core reasons India seems to have reconsidered its stance on the treaty so fundamentally.
Well, number one, overwhelmingly, according to the material, is national security and terrorism.
Right.
India's perspective appears to be that continued state-sponsored or supported terrorism from Pakistan makes it impossible, or at least untenable, to maintain a business-as-usual approach on something as vital as water sharing. It's seen as no longer just a technical agreement.
And public opinion played a role.
Definitely. The sources suggest that after major attacks, there was growing public pressure in India. People asking, why should we share water with a country harming us? That blood and water quote resonated.
So the Pahalgam attack was the final straw.
It appears so. The Foreign Secretary explicitly linking the treaty suspension directly to Pakistan stopping support for terrorism really cemented that shift. Terrorism and water, now inseparable in India's policy view. A huge change from 1960.
A massive shift. Okay, second reason you mentioned earlier, changed circumstances.
Yes, the fundamental and unforeseen changes argument. It's not just population growth, though that's huge, massive water stress in both countries now compared to 1960. Agriculture, industry, cities. Everyone needs more water.
And climate change is a big part of that.
A huge part. Glacial melt is changing, river flows, rainfall's more erratic, you get worse droughts, bigger floods. India's point is, the treaty just wasn't designed for this reality.
Plus the energy needs.
Right. The push for clean energy, especially hydropower, is much stronger now.
Correct.
India feels it needs these projects, and the old treaty framework, they argue, doesn't adequately accommodate this, especially with climate change demanding new water management approaches. The 1960 rules feel outdated to them.
Okay. And the third major factor said to be India's frustration over how the treaty itself was working or not working. Pakistan's objections.
Exactly. What India perceives as Pakistan's obduracy. There's a long history there, sources say, of Pakistan raising objections to almost every Indian water project on the western rivers.
Like Kishanga and Rattle we talked about.
Precisely. India sees Pakistan as dragging these projects into international disputes, often bypassing the treaty's own step-by-step process, going straight to third parties like the World Bank or arbitration.
Which India considers a violation?
Yes, a violation of the spirit and the letter of the treaty's dispute resolution mechanism. It led to that weird situation of parallel proceedings, court of arbitration, and neutral expert at the same time, which even the World Bank called unusual and potentially damaging.
So India's overall argument is?
Essentially, that Pakistan has consistently used the treaty's mechanisms to obstruct India's legitimate rights and projects, while benefiting unfairly from the arrangement. They feel Pakistan's actions undermine the treaty's functioning, making a full review necessary.
And finally, you mentioned internal politics in India.
Yeah, that's clearly a background factor. After big terror attacks, there's always immense domestic political pressure to do something. Questions get raised publicly, why keep giving water? It pushes the government towards a tougher stance.
So water becomes seen as potential leverage.
It seems to have shifted that way, yes. From a purely technical issue to something potentially used in the national security context, leading eventually to this suspension.
Okay, so the treaty is suspended. This is huge. What are the potential impacts? Let's start with the political fallout. For India first.
Well, for India, it signals a really dramatic diplomatic shift, using water explicitly as leverage against terrorism. Domestically, this probably plays well, shows decisiveness, toughness, a sort of water strike, some might call it.
But internationally, suspending a treaty like this.
That's the risk. India needs to be careful about its image. Unilaterally suspending a respected, long-standing treaty could damage its reputation as a responsible international player. But the message is also clear. India feels its security red lines have been crossed, and it's willing to use powerful tools in response.
And for Pakistan, politically.
It's a massive shock. The treaty was seen almost as sacrosanct, guaranteed regardless of who was in power or how bad relations got. That basic trust is shattered.
So intense pressure internally.
Huge pressure on the government, civilian or military, to respond forcefully. Prime Minister Sharif calling that Emergency National Security Committee meeting shows how seriously they're taking it.
What might they do?
Likely scramble for international support. Go to the World Bank, the UN, friendly countries arguing India is violating international norms. Domestically, maybe some anti-India rallying effect, but also potentially some tough questions internally about the policies that led to this point.
So relations even more strained.
Definitely. Prospects for any kind of normal dialogue seem very distant now, and the wider world gets more worried about South Asian stability. The water dispute on top of everything else is not good.
Let's talk economics. This seems like it could hit one country much harder than the other.
Oh, undoubtedly. Pakistan is expected to bear the immediate and severe economic consequences. Its whole agricultural sector, which is huge, depends overwhelmingly on Indus system water. Over 80% of irrigated land.
And drinking water.
Yes. For over 210 million people, these rivers are the main source for drinking water, daily needs. If India actually restricts flow significantly, It can mean a devastating water crisis, droughts.
What about their big dams, Mangla, Tarbela?
They're crucial. For power, for irrigation storage, reduced flow would hit them hard. Power cuts, huge agricultural losses. You could be looking at a food security crisis on top of Pakistan's existing economic problems like inflation and energy shortages.
So potentially an existential economic threat.
For Pakistan, it really could be. They might pump more groundwater, but that's unsustainable long term, leads to other environmental problems. It's a very, very serious economic challenge.
And for India, economically.
Less direct impact, possibly even some long-term opportunities.
Yeah.
India actually hasn't been using its full entitlement under the treaty estimates, but maybe 10% of its share was flowing downstream unused.
So suspending the treaty means India could use that water?
Potentially, yes. Without the treaty obligations, they could fast-track projects on the western rivers to use more of that water within India. Could benefit farmers in Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, boost hydropower projects too, like the long-delayed Tobal Navigation Project or others.
But that takes time and money, right? Building infrastructure.
Absolutely, it's not an overnight benefit. Requires investment. And completely killing the treaty framework might create uncertainty for investors too. Plus, India has to think about its downstream responsibilities generally, its reputation with other neighbors like Bangladesh over shared rivers like the Ganges.
Okay, finally, the environment. Rivers don't care about borders. What are the ecological risks here?
Huge risks. The Indus Basin is one ecosystem. If India builds more dams upstream on the western rivers and significantly cuts the flow reaching the sea.
What happens downstream in Pakistan?
One major concern is seawater intrusion into the Indus Delta in Sindh. Less freshwater pushing back means saltwater moves further inland, destroying farmland, mangrove forests, fisheries. It's already happening, but this could make it much worse.
And floods, the treaty involved data sharing, right?
Yes, flood forecasting data was shared. If that stops, coordinated flood management becomes impossible. Sudden releases from upstream dams without warning downstream could cause catastrophic floods, loss of life.
And then there's climate change hanging over all this.
Exactly. Glaciers melting faster, weird weather. The basin is already stressed. What's needed is more cooperation on water management, not less. Breaking the treaty undermines any joint effort to adapt.
So focus shifts from river health to just fighting over water shares.
That's the danger. Pollution control, ecosystem monitoring, all that gets sidelined. And any new dams change the river's natural flow, sediment patterns, hurting aquatic life. It's a shared system. Upstream actions have downstream consequences. Pakistan always feared India could cause droughts or floods. Suspending cooperation makes both more likely.
Experts were already saying the treaty needed technical updates for climate change, right?
They were. Now that dialogue is frozen, making sensible updates much harder.
So this is a really critical, uncertain moment. Where could things go from here? What are the possible scenarios?
Well, it's definitely precarious. India's move is clearly a pressure tactic, linking water to terrorism. What happens next? Several possibilities.
Okay, like what?
One path. Pakistan tries diplomatic and legal routes, appeals to the World Bank, maybe the International Court of Justice, argues India's suspension is illegal.
Is it illegal? Suspension versus termination.
It's murky in international law. There isn't really a clear provision for unilateral suspension like this. So the legal outcome is uncertain. Pakistan will definitely seek international pressure on India. Arguing water is a basic necessity shouldn't be weaponized.
What's another possibility?
Dialogue. Maybe back-channel talks, maybe mediated by a third party. If Pakistan feels the pressure is too high, they might be forced to engage, perhaps offer concessions on the terrorism front to get the treaty reinstated.
India did talk about amendments, not just scrapping it.
Exactly. So if Pakistan makes credible moves on terrorism, maybe India agrees to revive the treaty, but in a revised form. Perhaps adding clauses related to terrorism or updating water use rules for climate change. That's probably the best outcome, but hard to imagine right now given the deep mistrust.
And the worst case?
Confrontation escalates. Both sides dig in. Pakistan doesn't satisfy India on terrorism. India maintains the water suspension long term. Tensions rise. Could it lead to military clashes? Maybe limited border skirmishes, sabotage? Full-scale war seems unlikely given nuclear weapons, but any conflict is disastrous. That's the scenario nobody wants.
So India's playing a high-stakes game here.
Very high stakes. Potentially big domestic gains for the government, showing toughness, but internationally risky. Pakistan faces a huge internal crisis, potential isolation. The world is watching very nervously.
And experts still think the treaty, maybe updated, is better than nothing.
Most seem to agree. For regional stability, For the millions dependent on the water, finding a way to preserve and modernize the framework is better than letting it collapse entirely. Termination really should be the last resort.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us with a huge question mark, doesn't it? Will the Indus waters be a bridge somehow still connecting these neighbors? Or are they becoming a hard line of division?
It really seems to hang in the balance. Depends so much on Pakistan's next steps regarding terrorism and how India chooses to react. It makes you think, doesn't it, about using something as fundamental as water in the game of geopolitics. What are the long-term costs?
Definitely something to keep watching. The situation is far from over. We hope this deep dive has given you the context to follow the developments.
Absolutely. Keep an eye on the news, the analysis. It's a critical issue, not just for India and Pakistan,
Yeah.
but for understanding water security and international relations everywhere.